Yeah. All right. Well, let me see who I see. I see Stephanie. Hello. Leanne. And we said hello to April. I see Samantha. Don't see everyone's name. Tiffany's here and Lori. Okay. All right. So hello, everybody who's joined so far.
Let's see.
I can see some names, but not all of them. So if I haven't mentioned your name, welcome.
Nancy, what part of the country?
Who's asking? Yeah. What part of the country am I in?
Yeah, what part of the country are
Oh,
you
hi,
in?
Maureen. I live in Kitty Hawk, North Carolina.
Oh,
Yeah, I've lived here for 17 years.
it's beautiful.
Prior to that, I raised my children in New Jersey, Northwest New Jersey, and it's primarily where I worked. All
Okay,
right.
I was going to say the accent sounded New York.
I have a little New York and a little Boston because I lived
Yes.
growing
Okay.
up outside of Boston. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so I don't have a Southern accent.
No.
My sister's been here longer than I, and she has a little bit of a Southern accent mixed in with Boston. So
I love North Carolina. I was a camp counselor in the western part for
in the
2
mountains.
years.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Where are you at, Maureen?
I'm in Connecticut. Okay. Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm outside of Hartford.
Yeah. Know Connecticut quite well. I know Rhode Island quite well. My son went to school there, vacationed on that shore. Yeah. Love New England.
I do too.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Welcome. Okay. See the numbers are going up. Yeah.
Yep. All right. It is 7 o'clock. I'm going to wait one more minute.
Or 8 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, or if you're in the UK,
It's midnight.
My goodness, that's true. Yeah.
That's priceless.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate all of you being here. I know how busy it is, and it's almost Friday.
It is almost Friday.
It's almost Friday, and it's late, and many of you, I think, are probably coming up on your spring break.
Yes.
Yeah, yes. So hallelujah, right?
Sure.
It can't come soon enough.
I can appreciate that.
All right, everybody. Would you please go on mute in case you have barking dogs, or in my case, a sleeping dog, but she snores. So, okay.
All right.
I just want to welcome everyone. I'm just going to give a brief overview of Nancy's expertise. Nancy was a national trainer for language. We call it LETTERS, but it stands for Language Essentials for Teachers of Reading and Spelling. And she co-authored Module 6 of LETTERS, Digging for Meaning, Teaching Text Comprehension, with Louisa Moats. Her chapter, Working with Word Meaning Vocabulary Instruction, can be found in the 4th edition of the Multisensory Teaching of Basic Skills. Most recently, Nancy co-authored the book that we're using tonight for our book review. And Nancy received the International Dyslexia Association's Margaret Bird Rawson Lifetime Achievement Award, which is a great achievement. Not too many people get that. So welcome, Nancy.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much, Donna. And let me thank you again for all that you're doing and for this opportunity to be here.
You're so welcome.
Well, you deserve a great deal of credit. So
thanks.
And I'm sure everybody who's here this evening is most appreciative. I'm very grateful that you've all decided to join this evening. And for those who will be watching the recording, I'm grateful to you as well. I recognize that sometimes we just have to do things at a different time, given all of the things that are on our plate. So this is session 2, March 25th, Comprehension Not So Simple. And if you were with me last time, or you've listened to the recording, I think you know why I called it this. Yes, I'm talking about the highlights from the Reading Comprehension Blueprint, but so important to keep in mind that comprehension is so complex. We visited that description last time, in which we talked about the fact it's not a single entity. You can't explain it with one unified model. When you think about it, you have to think about it as the product of these multiple language and cognitive processes and skills. And of course, there's a relationship then in terms of making meaning with the read of the text, the task, and the context. So while word recognition is certainly difficult for many students and not easily attained by so many, this is really far more complex. And I think that's important for us to keep in mind. So I'd love to give you just some straightforward answers about everything. We know a great deal, but I think our knowledge base continues to evolve. And we really have to dig into this to understand how to meet the needs of all our students. Okay. So after the last session, my brain sort of works best in the morning. So, being at this time at night, I'm trying to stay as sharp as possible. And I realized after that last session that there were some very good questions, and perhaps it would be helpful if I just did some additional resources for you. So Donna has uploaded these for you. I believe they're in the hub. And someone asked me for the article on the simple views. So there's a link to the article. Someone asked me about background knowledge. There is what I consider the instructional tools or an informed structure for building, activating, building, and connecting to background knowledge. Included here also, someone asked me about inference, is some general approaches in one particular strategy for inference. And then a very good resource, the Elsa Cardenas-Hagen book for EL students. So after this evening, if there's some other things that pop up that I can share a resource on, I certainly will. All right, so last time, just a quick review. We talked about the blueprint, which is a structured approach. We talked about the fact that it's based in the science. And so we shared some models with you, the reading rope, for instance, Oak Hill and Kane's levels of language processing. There are certainly other theoretical models that are referenced within the text itself. We talked about how the blueprint identifies, or it helps us to identify, knowledge or critical understandings that we want our students to walk away with from the text. Also, literacy skills. So thinking about reading comprehension from the perspective of, it's not just about acquiring these language processes and skills. Certainly important to have vocabulary, be able to make sense of sentences, be able to connect to background knowledge, but it's also about learning. It's also about acquiring knowledge, all right? And then thinking a little bit about the readings that we use, thinking about what we currently have in curriculum, how we can make better use perhaps of those readings, how we can supplement, or if we have choice, making purposeful choice. And then of course, the inclusion of evidence-based strategies. So there's the blueprint, right? This is just a quick review. You, again, this evening have a participant guide. And so I've included in your participant guide a copy of the blueprint, just in case you don't have the book, right? So last time round, we focused on the top part of the blueprint, preparing for instruction. Remember that when we look at the blueprint, we talk about preparing for instruction, and then we talk about text reading. Not a lesson plan, not a unit organizer. They can be derived from this. But really a master plan framework for thinking through both process and product, can be used flexibly, all right? And so I think we ended with that bi-directional arrow indicating, when you're thinking about how do you develop these processes and skills, what I mean by processes and skills are language and cognitive processes and skills, specifically the ability to understand the meaning of a word, to integrate that with the understanding of sentences, to integrate that with your background knowledge, to be able to use that then to make inference and then express understanding. That's the text reading part. To the right, all of these questions encourage us to be metacognitive, to be thinking about our own thinking. Of course, that's what effective educators do, all right? To be thinking about the kinds of questions we should be asking ourselves if in fact our focus is vocabulary. or if it's language structures, phrases, clauses, sentence comprehension, or if it's knowledge, or different levels of understanding and inference, or expression of understanding. What has the literature, what has the science told us is the most effective ways of approaching, right, those different processes and skills? And so that's what the questions reflect. All right. So session 2, what does informed comprehension instruction include? Our focus this evening will be vocabulary and sentence comprehension. So if in fact you do have the book, vocabulary is chapter 4, sentence comprehension, it's the blueprint for syntax, and sentence comprehension is chapter 5. Okay. And again, these will be highlights because obviously we can't talk about every single thing, but we'll talk about as much of it as we can. Right. So there's the comprehension house. We're constructing comprehension, and our focus again will be one of these main pillars, because certainly vocabulary and background knowledge all are important, and they're all interrelated, just as the strands of the rope are woven together and interrelated. But we know that vocabulary and background knowledge have some significant effects on, all right? And the reality is you're not going to be able to understand a sentence if you don't understand the meaning of the words to begin with, right? So we're going to talk about vocabulary, we're going to talk about sentence comprehension. Each of the chapters, just so you have a sense of this, is organized for the most part in the way that's reflected here in this particular box. So there's always connections to classroom, always examples, student examples, text examples, connections to comprehension. You know, why are we talking about this if it doesn't in fact contribute to overall understanding of text? And then specific definitions and descriptions of whatever the topic happens to be, effective instructional practices, some adaptation to individual needs. There was a question last time, for instance, about EL students. And then also there was a question about assessment. So there's informal assessment. So just to give you a sense of, and again, we'll touch upon as much of this as we can. So take a moment and read this with me. You can do it out loud if you're by yourself, or you can do it to yourself. Words are not just words. They are the nexus, the interface between communication and thought. When we read, it is through words that we build, refine, and modify our knowledge. What makes vocabulary valuable and important is not the words themselves as much as the understandings they afford. It's Marilyn Adams. And I think that's a beautiful way of thinking about how important word meaning is to understanding and how it does directly connect to knowledge. And when we know words well, we don't know them in isolation. We know them in connection with other related words and concepts. They reflect our understanding of topic. Okay, so we're going to do some connections. Vocabulary is up first, and we're going to connect to comprehension, do something on definition and description, and then do a little bit on an informed instructional framework. So again, I want to make that connection to students, and I want you to be thinking about, you know, dependent upon what your students are reading, notice that there's a mix here of both narrative and informational text. Be thinking about, well, what do your students need to know and be able to do when they come to this text in terms of word meaning? You know, when they're confronted with challenging words, right? Words, for instance, from the founding of a democracy like representative or federalism, right? Words, for instance, when they come to the, even as they're listening or reading, younger children, the ant and the grasshopper, when they're talking about distributing stores of what? Stores of food. That's a different meaning for stores, isn't it? Right? Or when we're talking about the one and only Ivan, right? And he's talking about humanity in a sense, or Stalin, you know, words like genocidal. So we could go on talking about the fact that there are challenging words that connect to understanding embedded within these texts. And remember, we talked about using grade and age appropriate texts. I want to clarify something. I'm not saying that decodable texts or even level texts don't serve in some ways a purpose. Well, in other ways, let me put it that way. don't serve a purpose in other ways, and that they still can be used for the development of these different processes and skills that I'm talking about, but not in a deep manner, right? We need to be focused on the language of school, the academic language, right? And so when I talked about the use of text, I talked about the fact that our students really need access to age and grade appropriate texts. Okay. And those texts should be across genre, across discipline, right? Should reflect the experience of the student. So let's keep that in mind. So if those are the needs of our students, what do you need to know and be able to do? Right. So start thinking a little bit about that. I also want to make a connection besides to the classroom here to comprehension. So why are we having this conversation about vocabulary, about the development of vocabulary? And I think most of you know the answer to this, but I think it's really critical that we're able to surface that for ourselves. And so you cats and colleagues, some of you may know you cats' work. He's at Florida State. He's a speech and language pathologist. He's very heavily involved in the world of dyslexia, but he also is very much involved in the language world. And he talks about the fact that as early as kindergarten, language measures, including vocabulary, are extremely good predictors of whether or not students will be successful at reading. Right. Freddie Hebert, some of you may know her work, Elfrida Hebert. She talks about vocabulary being this bridge between word level processes and the processes of comprehension. And sometimes I just want to pull that strand of the reading rope down a little bit and make connections, because you know what, when you really know how to read a word accurately and automatically, oftentimes the meaning pops right up, right? It's that phonology, orthography, semantics connection. And then last but not least, we know that our kiddos who have better vocabulary knowledge score better, all right? They perform better, they score better, higher reading comprehension scores concurrently and longitudinally. So why are we talking about vocabulary? Just a few reasons here, right? And then again, why are we talking about it? Because the reading rope, right? And one of the strands of the reading rope that Hollis identified certainly was vocabulary. And Monique asked me a question about reading rope. So let me clarify why I'm using this version. Right. This version of the reading rope, Hollis Scarborough herself used in a talk that she gave when she received an award named for her. And I have her permission to use it. All right. And one of the things that she wanted to show is that arrow that runs across the bottom, which says time. All right. Hollis comes from a developmental perspective and believes that over time, all right, these skills, processes, and so on develop. And she wanted that represented, and it wasn't represented in the original. It was left off in the original chapter in the Handbook of Early Literacy. Okay, all right. She also talks about, when she talks about vocabulary on the original rope, she talks about breadth, she talks about precision, and she talks about links. Those are in parentheses. Keep those words in mind. And then I had shared this with you last time, and just bringing it back again to remind you that, you know, we have this interaction between the student and the text and the task represented here at the top. And then what does the student have to do? And this is really very connected to O'Kill and Kane's description of the levels of language processing. Well, they have to make sense of the words. And for our students, as they move through the grades, those words and phrases, right, tend to be more sophisticated, not our everyday language. We move from oral to printed language, but the language of text is academic language. So here we're talking about academic vocabulary, words that are not your Anglo-Saxon words, words that are more derived from Latin and Greek, right, that are more sophisticated, more nuanced. And there's breadth, depth, and precision. Okay. So that's our focus for this evening. And then of course, we said, well, it isn't just about these language processes, what's going on in the mind of the student. And Judith Irwin says, well, you can think about it this way, all right? The student has to figure out those idea units. That's microprocessing. And the words, the vocabulary, the meaning of the words are contributing to the idea units. And then what happens? those words combined within the sentences, right? And what they have to be able to do, the student, is integrate the meanings within and between the sentences. We'll talk some more about that later. And then they have to be thinking about what they're reading, making sense, and integrating their background knowledge, and then arriving at what we call that mental model. But again, our focus is at the surface level. You see where it says surface code? The exact words and syntax that the author is using to convey those idea units. That's what we're talking about this evening. All right. So that was connection to classroom and to comprehension. All right. And I'm going to move us now to definition and description. Right. And you had, again, a participant guide. So you have an opportunity to do a quick write. And I want you to just think a little bit about what words come to mind when you think about what vocabulary is. So just let's take, I don't know, maybe 15, 20 seconds for you to do some scripting. You don't have the participant guide handy. You can be thinking about this. Okay, let's just take another few seconds. All right, so let me share some of my thinking, and let's see whether or not we align. Oops. Okay. So you might have written, I mean, there are all sorts of ways of thinking about vocabulary, but you might have said, well, academic words, or you might have said all the words we know, or you might have said your lexicon, which is really your mental dictionary, right? And all of those would be so, right? Or you might have said something like understanding what the meaning of words are. Okay. I'm thinking about vocabulary from this perspective, right? I'm thinking about it from the perspective of we have both receptive and expressive vocabulary. When we think about our use of words, we use words to understand what's coming in, and we use words to demonstrate our understanding or to put out our understanding. So receptive vocabulary, right, is all about reading vocabulary. Do we know the meaning of the words that we're reading within the context of print? Do we know the meaning of words as we listen to a speaker, right? And by the way, when we listen to a speaker, we have more clues to word meaning, don't we? Because there's lots of nonverbal clues that we can use as well. All right, so that's receptive vocabulary. So we want to develop our students' vocabulary, their understanding of word meaning for receptive purposes. But we also want to develop our students' ability to use their knowledge of word meaning to express understanding, whether they're writing or speaking. And one's expressive vocabulary is usually less than one's receptive vocabulary. Well, that makes sense, doesn't it? Because there's a context that surrounds, whether it's print or oral, right? There's a context that surrounds reading and listening vocabulary. There's some clues for us. In terms of writing and speaking, we have to find those meanings and use precise words in order to express our understanding. And the more precise, the deeper our knowledge base. And I'm going to suggest to you now, before we even get to instruction, that when you take time to directly, explicitly teach word meaning, you should be teaching it so that your students can use those words expressively, not just understand them receptively. Well, how do we acquire those word meanings, all right? Well, one of the things that we know is that word meaning grows over time. So it's incremental. It's bit by bit. I would even ask you to think about the word comprehension and what you know about it now versus maybe what you knew 5 years ago, 10 years ago, and ways in which you think about it in a deep way, right? When children are little, or even sometimes when we hear a new word, We fast map it. We think, oh, that's interesting. Let me hold on to that. But we only after exposure and experience with the word are able to really hold on and use that word. That's called slow mapping. Also, the more we're engaged with word, all right, the more we learn about word. We don't store word in isolation. We store it within a network. And when we talk about semantic networks, we're talking about storing words with other related words, for instance, synonyms and antonyms. We also, or concepts that the word is related to. Think about the word democracy. What's the semantic network for democracy? Also, our knowledge of word meaning is multidimensional. Lots of different networks lighting up in the brain. You know it's phonology, you know it's orthography, you know it's morphology. Sounds familiar, I'm doing language systems, right? You know it's syntax. You probably know it's figurative language use, if in fact it's used in a figurative language way, right? As well as other things. That's deep knowledge. That only comes with experience, instruction, and experience. Keep this in mind as we think about how we make good decisions about vocabulary instruction. Right? So this relates then to a breadth of knowledge, a depth of knowledge, and our ability to be fluent with word meaning. So you may be familiar with these words, with these terms, right? Sometimes we talk about levels of understanding that students have about word meanings. For instance, and it's not my idea, but here's my variation on it. I don't recognize that word at all. Right? That word lives in my neighborhood. Oh yes, sometimes I hang around with that word. Oh, that word is my BFF, best friends. That's the difference between breadth and depth, or not knowing a word at all right? But I'm going to give you a moment to do a quick read here, to read through what the definitions are of breadth, depth, and fluency, and then we'll talk about why this is meaningful. And I think this is on your participant guide as well. All right, so you may have heard these terms before, and think about the rope again. The rope has breadth, precision, and lengths, right? Important to know that we recognize thousands and thousands of words. You know, when we read that, for instance, a young adult or a high school graduate knows, I don't know, 50,000, 60,000 words. It doesn't mean they know them all deeply. They recognize them. Okay? They recognize them on average. It depends upon the individual, right? We recognize words when they're within context. Context oftentimes will support the word. Okay. But depth really means that we know all of those things that I just talked about a word. It's our richness of word knowledge. And this is particularly important in terms of that expressive understanding, all right, or the expressive use of word meaning. And fluency is how quickly can you access. Now, I know you probably haven't thought about, or most of us haven't thought about fluency or automaticity relating to word meaning. But the reality is when you can, in an automatic way, access the meaning of word, what does it do? It frees up cognitive resources for some of those other processes that are necessary to make meaning. Important to keep in mind. Okay, so we did our quick read. So here's the connection from research. This is Jane Oakhill. Vocabulary knowledge at deep levels, depth, and in particular the speed, fluency, with which that knowledge can be accessed is predictive of reading comprehension skill. So recognition is important, and we need that, right? And we can't learn all words at a deep level. But depth is also critical, particularly in terms of classroom tasks when you ask kiddos to demonstrate understanding either orally or in writing. And then the second part, So read that to yourself. Okay, so Kane, Oakland, Elbro, in their book on comprehension, are saying to us, it's important for comprehension, for making meaning. It's important to be able to work with that surface level of the text, but ultimately it contributes to that mental model that allows for us to demonstrate understanding. All right. So we've done connections to comprehension. We've done definition and description. Here's the part everybody wants to get to. All right. An informed instructional framework. All right. So your turn again before we do this. Script 3 to 4 words that describe how you teach word meaning. And if some of you want to put a few of these up in the chat, that would be great as well. And maybe Donna and I can take a look at the chat as you're doing that. I'll just give you a minute to script. April says she's been purposefully spending time on vocab this year, and she's noticing her kids are connecting to other books we read. Woohoo, building knowledge. And Melissa is saying vocabulary is not taught in any kind of systematic fashion, and continue in this manner is to do so at our peril. I totally agree. Right? Does anyone want to put 3 to 4 words in the chat about how you currently teach? Define a word, use it in a sentence. Okay, Maureen. Good. Explicit routine, practice use. Yeah. Word mapping. Interesting. A lot of pictures. There are many kinds of bands. Yeah, I love that you're bringing that up, Melissa, because when I mention something about decodable text, a lot of times decodable texts have words with multiple meanings, and we shouldn't skip over that. That's what I meant, that sometimes we can tap into the decodable text, although I don't see it as the primary source for vocabulary instruction. Okay. Synonyms, examples, pictures. Oh, student-friendly definitions. So I'm going to affirm for many of you what you're doing. Okay. Yeah, the students self-assess. That's that levels of understanding I was talking about. Okay, cool. All right. So let's see what I have to say about this. All right. So don't forget, the blueprint has those questions, right? All right. Which words will your students need to know, which are worth knowing? Which ones will you intentionally target, directly teach? All right, that's the first pillar. Which ones will you incidentally on purpose teach? How and when? That's the second pillar. How and when will you teach and foster the use of independent word learning strategies? The third pillar. And then something about using expressively. The fourth pillar is word consciousness. So let's go to the informed structure so you can see exactly what I'm talking about. So this is what I call the informed structure of vocabulary instruction, and it reflects those questions, but it isn't all out of my head. It reflects all the reading that I've done, the research that's been done. It reflects the work of people like Michael Graves and Elfrida Hebert and Isabel Beck and Margaret McCune and all these people who, Andy B. Miller, all these individuals who have focused on vocabulary and have said to us, when you think about vocabulary instruction, you need to think about an approach that includes intentional instruction, first pillar. Incidental on purpose, those are my words, but incidental on purpose instruction, second pillar. Intentional teaching of independent word learning strategies, third pillar. And then word consciousness, which is sort of this interest, developing an interest, a motivation for learning about words. This evening, I'm going to focus on the first column. Right? That doesn't mean that I don't think the others are important, right? But I'm going to focus because of time on the first. So if in fact we're making decisions to directly, explicitly teach words, what do we need to think about? Well, word choice might be important. Even if your curriculum provides you with the words, this is something you need to be thinking about. Are they the right words? Principles of instruction. What are you going to use to guide how you go about designing your instruction? What might instructional routines look like based on those principles of instruction? What might processing and practice activities look like based on those principles of instruction? Okay, let's take a look. So I chose Tuck Everlasting, but again, there are examples that I could give from informational text as well, social studies, science, even math. There are different types of narrative text that I could use. I just happened to choose this particular one for this evening, but no, there are other examples if you have access to the book. If not, you have your own curriculum that you're looking at. So I like to be efficient in terms of making decisions about which words I want to teach explicitly. So when I prepare, when I preview my text and I prepare, right, I'm going to use criteria, and you can see the criteria that are listed there. Some of you may use criteria like Beck. Some of you may use academic word lists. Some of you may use the work of Andy B. Miller to guide you. That's fine. There are different ways to approach this, right? But here's one way that also reflects the science, the research, and it's thinking about the usefulness and importance of words. This is similar to Beck's tiers, if you know Beck's tiers. So how useful is this word going to be? Is this a word that, as Beck talks about it, you see across different areas, right? How important is this word in terms of understanding this text, but also in general terms, understanding? And can you grow words, other words from this particular word? So you just see a representation. When I went through the text, I started to think about, I think I want to teach those words intentionally. And I think incidentally, on purpose, I'm going to use point of contact where either I provide a synonym or substitution if I'm reading aloud, or if my students are reading independently, I'll have them annotate as they move through and will provide a substitution or synonym, tranquil, trespassing, immense, and so on. And then I'm going to think about, are there some words that lend themselves to understanding through context? And of course, I would have directly, explicitly taught how you identify through context, definition, examples, synonyms, so on. Are there some words that I might use morphology? And of course, if I'm talking about some specific words, I would have done some work with morphemes ahead of time, particularly common ones, right? So thinking about my choice of word, but in this case, the focus right now, because I'm talking about intentional instruction, would be those words in the first column. Is this a perfect, is there a perfect formula for this? No, there isn't, all right? So if you're working with a team of teachers, for instance, and you have the opportunity to look at your curriculum, you might want to think through, look at your criteria, and you may want to say, wow, these words are terrific for this particular text, or you might say, I think I might have to add some words. And don't forget about the fact that you know your students. Remember, I said, keep in mind your context, your curriculum, and your students. I said that last time. Okay. What about a routine? Well, this is the work of Stephen Stahl, no longer with us, but wow, did great work in the area of reading. And others have said something similar. When you think about a routine, all right, you want to base it on instructional principles. Well, here's some instructional principles. You need to use definitional and contextual information when you introduce words, right? I call that a simple routine. But if you want your words to stick, if you're going for depth, right, then your kids need something more. They need the complex routine, which includes multiple exposures, engagement in deep processing, and multiple varied activities. So you need to return to words, but when you first introduce, you can use a simple routine and provide some additional activities, and then start thinking about some other ways to keep embedding those words for your students. Right. Let's go on and take a look at an example of the simple routine. Now, I'm going to go through this pretty quickly because I'm going to have you be my students in a moment. All right. The simple routine, and this may sound very much like what you're doing because, again, this is reflected in the literature. All right. You want to pronounce the targeted word and discuss the structure and/or ask questions about the linguistic structure. Right? So you want your students listening. This has everything to do with what? The phonology of the word. It also has something to do with syntax of the word if you choose to include that here, and you'll see that in a moment. You want to ask your students to repeat. You want to make sure that they've heard that word capable of repeating. Again, phonology. You want to explain the meaning in everyday language. Remember a moment ago, I said you have to include definitional information, but not in dictionary talk. We don't speak in dictionaries. I know there's some student-friendly dictionaries out there, so that might work. Okay. You want to provide examples from context. And if we're using the text as the base for the words that we're teaching, then the context comes from the text. And then you can go further by asking your students for examples. And now you want to have your students not only say the word, but you're going to help them spell the word. Here's the orthography, and you're going to have them write that word. Okay. So are you all ready to be my students? This is scripted for you. Well, not totally scripted, but the examples are found in your participant guide. So here's the student behavior. I just did the teacher behavior. Be my student. So listen carefully. I'm going to read this to you, all right? And for those of you who have the book, it's on page 68, okay? And I'm going to change up the order just a little bit. You ready? We're going to learn about the word immortal today. So this word is coming from tech everlasting, right? Listen as I say the word and get ready to echo. But first, how many syllables do you hear in immortal? Now remember I said you want to talk about linguistic structure. So how many syllables do you hear? Immortal. Now I could ask, all right, if I feel comfortable with this, I could ask how many morphemes are in immortal as well, if that's where my students are at. The other thing I could ask is, I wonder if you know this word's part of speech. Here's a hint, okay? Does it answer the question, what kind, how many? Yeah, it does. You know what? It describes the tuck family or characteristic that they now have. This word is an adjective. Now you could ask it now, or you can wait to ask it a little later. You could be a little flexible with that, okay? All right, so you need to echo the word. So everyone, what's the word?
Immortal.
Yeah, okay. All right, we also need to provide some examples in terms of this, as well as the definition. So we know that no one lives forever. We have a word that describes it. It's the word immortal. Okay. People are mortal. It is natural for people to die, but if someone could live forever, he or she would be immortal. The family members in tuck everlasting live forever. They are immortal. So this is the context, right? They have discovered a spring whose waters are magical. They have all drunk from the spring, and as a result, they are immortal. They will live forever. Now, it could be a little shorter than that, but it gives you a sense, right? Then I would say, what does this word mean to you? Do you know anyone who's immortal, right? So anyone have a thought on that? What might a fourth or fifth grader say?
Greek, like the Greek gods.
Like the Greek gods, perfect. Yeah, or maybe they might see something like superheroes, you know. All right, and then it would be your time now to write, and so I would write for you, all right, if I could, the word immortal, but listen as I spell it, and spell it with me. Say the word immortal. IMMORTAL. Okay. So it gives you a sense of, that's the simple routine, right? Did you notice though that as I was doing that, I was making for you the connections to those systems of language? There was a reason we did that activity the other night, right? When you know a word well, you know about all these different systems of language that are connected to the word. Okay. Now, what about this complex aspect? Okay. Well, when we think about this, we're thinking about what are the ways in which we can give our students opportunity to practice and process the word, right? And so here's just a general way of thinking about this, right? We can have our students connect, represent, or use, right? Connect has everything to do with semantic connections. So things like semantic maps, semantic feature analysis, concept maps, right? Because remember we said we store in networks and words are interrelated, right? We also know that representations can be very powerful, all right? And someone mentioned that in their comment. So pictures, drawings, videos, right? Gestures and movement, right? Word walls. And I'm going to show you an example of a word wall, okay, for vocabulary. And then this whole idea of expressive use, remember depth? So questions, examples, conversation prompts, writing stems. Now, this is just a general way of thinking about this. Okay. And all of this is in the PowerPoint. So I wanted to give you some examples from Tuck. Okay. So Connect-Semantic Features, shades of meaning, right? We could talk about the fact that the word exhausted, we can talk about synonyms or what we might call substitutions, more precise word meaning, right? What's the difference between tired, sleepy, pooped, burned out, exhausted? That's almost a continuum of meaning, isn't it? We can talk about opposites, tired versus rested. That's that scaling. Or we can think about shades of meaning, these nuances again. I'm tired, I'm sleepy, no, I'm exhausted, even deeper, darker blue. There was a reason. Okay. Sometimes when you work with this kind of an activity with your student, you have to provide some of these other words, right? And have them arranging. So you can use manipulatives, for instance, right? You can have discussions about this with them. And how much of this you do is dependent upon your student's lexicon, right? But you always want to be building out. Okay. How about represent drawings and word walls? Okay, now there's your typical drawing, 2 words from Tuck, conceal and isolated. I know the drawings are kind of sophisticated for some kids. So they might be doing something that's a little bit more stick-like, or you might have them go to Google Images, right? Or find the pictures. They don't have to draw them. By the way, I'm a little proud of those representations. My grandson did them, right? The word wall. The word wall is a grammar word wall. Nouns, who or what? That's the question that a noun answers. Verbs, is or was doing. Adjectives, which one, what kind, how many. And the words have been sorted, right? The words that we've chosen for direct, explicit instruction. And then use. Here's some examples for that. We won't do all of them. If I say something that could describe feeling isolated, then raise your hand. So that's one of the words from Tuck. Okay, I'm all by myself. I'm feeling very lonely. I don't have any friends. You want to raise your hand? I do, right? Or applaud how much you want to feel exhausted. I don't think so. How about energetic? And again, this is similar to a Beck and McCune activity, right? So thinking about vocabulary, direct explicit teaching, word choice, what are the principles of instruction? What could your routine look like based on the principles of instruction? How do you give students opportunity for definitional and contextual information, as well as opportunities to work with a word? Now, you can't do all of these, obviously, but you certainly need to do some of them. Now, everybody usually wants this, and it is in the PowerPoint. So this is an instructional roadmap that represents in blue the simple routine, all right? Word choice and then definition. Context is dependent upon the text. In orange, it represents what I just talked about, the complex routine, connect, represent, and use. And I've included some additional examples in each of these. Now, you may have other examples that you could pop into these boxes as well. For instance, word choice, there's the guidelines I used, but sometimes we use word lists, or sometimes we use Beck, flexibility, right? But always based on what the literature has told us. Definition, how do I go about defining? I use word maps, right? A word map, for instance, places a word in a category if it's a noun, and some features, and then examples. If it's an adjective, it's usually a synonym, and then some characteristics, right? Some of you might use Foursquare. In your words, just the fact, paint a picture related but, or similar words. I would say this to you, Foursquare Sometimes you can begin with a 4-square, but really a 4-square is really kind of an end product once the student really has learned more about the word. And dimensions is very much a deep understanding. Okay, I'm not going to go into all of these, but just an idea for some things that you can do, an instructional roadmap. Be thinking about what else you do and how you might add to this. Right. So I didn't talk about incidental. I didn't talk about intentional independent word learning or word consciousness. I just want to say this to you, that students acquire their vocabulary before they can read independently, primarily through oral language. Once they can read independently, right, they acquire most of their vocabulary, because we can't teach them all the words, through independent reading. So that's important to keep in mind. So what I've included under incidental on purpose is some things you can control within your classroom that reflect that, plus good oral language. And then the third column really represents the fact that you can't always be with your students, neither can their parents or their tutors, all right? And so they need some ways to figure out meanings of words. And they can do that through the dictionary, certainly, but context clues and morphemic analysis. Okay. Last time somebody asked me about EL students, all right? This is not in my book, but I mentioned, and I included this in the additional resources for you, Elsa Cardenas-Hagen's book, and the chapter on vocabulary includes just a few more strategies for EL students, some of which are very similar to what I've just talked about. We always begin with good effective instruction, and then we can think about layering on it. So shared book reading, connections across language structure and history of language, cognates. We know that there are many, many words. You know, those Latin roots, all right? There are many, many words that are similar. For instance, in Spanish to English, even in French to English, because of that base. Promoting native language vocabulary learning and then making those connections. And then there's that deep processing. Okay. Last but not least, I mentioned something about assessment last time. And I wanted to say to you that the standardized assessments that we have for reading comprehension are very general in nature, and they tap into different things. And I know speech and language have some wonderful assessments, but they're diagnostic and comprehensive and sometimes called for students. But oftentimes we have students that are just struggling that don't have access to those assessments. And we have to be thinking about how can we be more diagnostic in our approach? What activities in our classrooms are we using that can be a source of information in terms of whether or not our students are acquiring breadth, depth, fluency? And so here's some examples. And again, they reflect many of the activities that you might be using that we can use as informal assessment tools. So for levels of word knowledge surveys, I mentioned something about that earlier. You know, do I recognize the word? Does it live in my neighborhood? Do I hang around with it? Am I BFF? Or I have no clue about this word. I know something about it, or I know everything about it. I mean, there are different ways to use those surveys. And then you can look at things like, can they construct a definition of the word? Can they answer questions about the word, probing into the definition? How about dimensions? That's depth. Maps, that's also reflective of depth. And then oral use, expressive language, depth, and so on. Okay, so just to give you a little sense of, sometimes I think we don't realize how valuable our activities can be. All right. Okay, time for ideas, questions, connections. It's a check-in time, just as we did this last time. So let's see, let's go to the chat.
Okay, we have got some. I actually was taking pictures of them. The latest one was, are you suggesting pausing your reading during the read aloud to go through the routine, meaning vocabulary, or do you have a separate vocabulary time when you return to previously read texts?
Yeah. So I would only pause during read alouds to do what I call that point of contact teaching, incidental on purpose. I would be, usually I would be doing the introduction, the simple routine prior to the reading of the text. And in terms of the activities, those activities more often than not are activities that you do after the reading of the text. So I tend to think about a focus for a lesson. Is the focus going to be on vocabulary, for instance? Will the focus be on sentence comprehension? Will the focus be on, or sometimes it's integrated. It just depends upon the text and the students. But pausing during the reading, I think that's an important thing to do. I think we can provide substitutions and synonyms, but it's not a time to do a routine.
Okay, great. Is there good value in a structured off-the-shelf vocabulary program? Or is it better to draw words from authentic texts?
Well, if in fact you want your students to be able to understand the meaning of the text that they're reading, all right, then you need to be teaching them the meaning of the words found within the text. Now, some of the off-the-shelf vocabulary programs can be used in a meaningful way as supplemental programs, I think, for students. But in terms of, think about how you build meaning of the text. You have to understand the meaning of the words. I think, let me see if I can quote, I've forgotten the exact authors of the quote, but I think students, it's been quoted that students need to at least recognize the meaning of 95% of the words to make meaning of the text. So I think important that you're working with your text. And certainly if you have sufficient time or you're doing supplemental activities, I mean, things like word generation, those kinds of things, they're quite effective and valuable, but you always have to be thinking about, what's the focus? Do you want your students to be able to work with those texts and walk away with knowledge of the text? Yeah.
Okay, here's one. Which of these strategies you shared would you recommend for primary grades?
I would adjust all of these strategies I wrote the book with kindergarten through 8th grade in mind, and I think you can be flexible with the strategies and activities and adapt them based on the level of the student. Some of the language I'm using is probably a bit sophisticated, but a routine, you certainly can use a routine with the young child. Now, you're not going to say what's the linguistic structure of the text, of the word, but you might say, how many parts do you hear in this word? Think a little bit about this word. Does it answer the question who or what, or which one, what kind? So I think you have to think about your own language as well. Is the comprehension house something you constructed? The answer is yes. And actually my grandson drew that as well. So I give you permission to use the comprehension house. He'd be thrilled.
Did you ever make that bookmark?
I didn't, but we talked about that, didn't we?
I know. I think you should make that. I think it's a great idea.
Okay. All right.
Okay, here's one from Melissa. What do you think about Deb Glazer's Morpheme Magic?
All right. I have not yet read her Morpheme Magic, but I know Deb Glazer and everything she does is outstanding. Okay.
Yeah, I know that program. I mean, I have it. It's very structured and it's a great exposure to words.
Look, I am a proponent of teaching kids morphemes for both word recognition. So for me, it's a way of teaching advanced word recognition as well as for vocabulary. It's really, I think, very, very important. And when I worked at AIM Academy, working with them on curriculum, it was one of the things we did focus on. Yeah.
Awesome.
I also like Brian Yashimoto's work too in that area, by the way. All right. So, yeah. Okay. Anything else?
Well, you have to hear this one, Nancy. This is from Melissa. It's just a comment. I spent an entire session getting a student to tell me the animals in the book were bored. I don't know what that meant. We're bored. Oh, and established a band. Okay. After 30 minutes, I asked him to define band, and he said, "It's that thing my sister wears in her hair."
Yeah. So it was, can you hear me?
Yes.
It was a whole reading comprehension.
Yeah. Yeah.
And he finally got to fluency and automaticity with his word recognition. And every page each animal in the jungle did something, tapped something, whistled, whatever, and created a band. It never occurred to me that he wouldn't know what a band was, especially since his mother was the singer in their church contemporary band.
Oh,
But finally, after asking the same comprehension question 3 times, I just said, okay, well, hold on. What is a band? And he goes, it's that thing my sister wears in her hair. And I thought, oh Lord, we've just
Multiple
wasted so
meanings,
much.
multiple meanings. We have to take advantage of it. Teaching them multiple meanings.
But I mean, there were pictures of instruments, like but he was just so language impaired.
Right. You can't assume, can you? What does it mean?
No,
You can't,
no,
we can't commit a suicide.
no.
All right, I'm going to move us on because I probably won't have enough time to talk as much about sentence comprehension as I want, syntax and sentence comprehension. So I have to tell you that, you know, I think more and more people are attending to sentence comprehension, syntax and sentence comprehension and its role in the overall understanding of text. But when I first started thinking about this and talking about this over 10 years ago, there weren't all that many people talking about it. Although Cheryl Scott, who was at Rush Medical now retired, was writing about it, and others were writing as well, but I was particularly impressed with what she had to say about how sentences can be problematic for students and where they get hung up on sentences. So anyway, I love talking about this and I won't have enough time to do it, but I'm going to try my best to give you some highlights. Okay, so take a moment and read this to yourself. So don't you love this idea of thinking about the sentences as the worker bees of the text? All right. Cheryl Scott said, one by one, they add up to the gist. Okay. And you know, I have never gotten this out of my mind, this way of thinking about sentences. And if you go back and you think a little bit about those levels of language processing that Kane and Oakhill talk about, this idea that you have to work out the syntactic structure of the sentence, and also start thinking about how Hollis has, you know, those language structures actually, which are semantics and syntax woven into the rote. I mean, you really start to think, wow, is this something that we've only been thinking about maybe for writing or maybe not at all? Yeah, okay. So we're going to talk about, again, connections to comprehension, definition and description, and then this informed instructional framework. So here's just a couple of sentences because I like to make that connection to the classroom. And that sentence is from Stalin, A Brutal Legacy Uncovered, which is Common Lit, by the way. You know, you can download some wonderful passages. And just look at that sentence, right? Never mind the vocabulary words, right? Let's assume that we've taken care of that. But that's one sentence, right? And what exactly is the structure of that sentence? Where's the who or the what and the is or was doing? You have to go looking for it, don't you? Searching for it. And then the second one, of course, that's about 8th or 9th grade. The second one, Mystery of the Tattoo Mummy, excuse me, comes from National Geographic magazine. This is probably around 3rd or 4th grade, but even that's a long sentence, right? So one of the things we have to start thinking about is, what do we need to know in order to help our students kind of unlock the meanings of these sentences? And there it is, of course, under language structures, so semantics and syntax. But here it is in the graphic that kind of represents that interaction again between the reader and the text and the task and the levels of language processing. And what we have to be thinking about is this, all right? Once we get into academic text, once we get into the text of school, and our students have to read it, but even before that, when we're reading to them, even good children's literature, the sentences are going to be dense. That means there's more than one idea. They're going to be long, a lot of words. They're going to be structured in different ways: simple, compound, complex, simple, or rather compound, complex. And they're going to have lots of embedded phrases and clauses. And the ideas within and between sentences are going to be tied up by the means of these devices called cohesive ties and connectives, which I'll touch on briefly tonight. In terms of cognitive processing, idea units, microprocesses, integrative, ideas within and between the sentences. You'll see what I mean in a moment about that. Okay. Okay, definition and description. Your turn. Syntax is. All right. Participant guide. Some of you might want to be brave and put it in the chat box. Yes, William Van Cleve does a lovely job with sentence writing and sentence structure. Yeah. See that in the chat. Melissa, I'd love a training. Yeah. Well, I do some workshops on sentence. Yeah, but William Van Cleve's training is pretty comprehensive. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, word order. Thank you, April. Okay. Let's see what everyone else is thinking. And let me show you what I'm thinking. So Lydia Sophia in multisensory teaching, talking about syntax, says it directs the production and comprehension of sentences. Right? Or we can think about how words combine to express what? Communicate thought, the internal structure of a sentence. Some of you might have been thinking about grammar, and grammar is not exactly the same, but closely related. So you might have been thinking about, subjects, predicates, and so on. How word order assists the transfer of meaning between minds, right? You might have been thinking about these basic rules for sentence comprehension or the arrangement of words. Okay. Here's another way of thinking about it. It's a vehicle for conveying meaning. So sometimes we think about syntax and we immediately think of grammar and we think of mechanics, right? But we need to think beyond that. We need to think about what's the function of these words within a sentence? How do they link up meaning? How do they express meaning individually? How do they convey meaning? This is why syntax and semantics are together under that strand of the reading rope. Language structures, because they're closely related. Syntax provides the vehicle for conveying semantics or meaning. Nancy Eberhardt, syntax lives within the sentence, which is the unit of language strategically positioned between individual words and texts. One by one, worker bees. Words contribute to the meaning of propositions, while syntax provides the structure for conveying the meaning of the idea units. So word order or structure. Okay. All right. So that's what syntax is. Well, let's go a little further here. And let's talk about instruction itself. So if I had the capability of putting up a poll, I would, but you can just think about this one. And this also is in your participant guide. How often do you address sentence comprehension instructionally? Frequently? Oh, I see thumbs down. Yeah, occasionally or never, right? And it is not at all unusual. I'm kind of scanning through, looking at your faces as you're looking at this. It is not at all unusual for teachers to say never or maybe occasionally, right? I think that, many of us think about sentences just in the realm of writing, right? We don't think about sentences in the realm of comprehension. And we need to make the connection. There's a tight connection between comprehension and writing, right? So we need to make that connection, because what does an author use to convey those idea propositions? They use sentences. Okay. So a little bit more thought in terms of the fact that some of our students get stuck right here, right here. They're not stuck in terms of the whole text. They're stuck right here. Okay. All right. So a little bit more. Okay. Here then is what I've asked on the blueprint. So are there phrases, clauses, and sentence structures that might be difficult for your students? We, along with our students, need to understand what a phrase is, what a clause is, what a sentence is. How and when will you directly teach sentence comprehension? How and when will you teach students to work with challenging sentences? Things like density, length, all right? those things make sentences difficult because there are embedded phrases and clauses. For instance, there's long distance dependencies between the who, the subject, the who or the what, the subject, and the is or was doing, the verb. Okay. How will you facilitate the integration of ideas within and between sentences? Oh, that shouldn't say the Sue, it should say the use of cohesive ties and connectives. All right. So let's begin with this, and I'm watching our time carefully. All right. A sentence is, all right. So everybody start thinking about how you would fill this in. This is not on your participant guide. And most people will say a sentence is what? A complete thought, right? Or a sentence is something that consists of a subject and predicate. Or a sentence is made up of an independent clause, right? And those tend to be more grammatical or structural definitions. Louisa Moat said this: it's a linguistic frame into which different categories of words fit. Boy, that's an interesting thing to think about, isn't it? All right. That's a language-based definition, not grammatical, not structural, but rather linguistic. And I think this captures it beautifully. Read this to yourself. So we have this linguistic frame, and we have these words, parts of speech, by the way, all right? And they fit into different slots, don't they? And those different slots convey meaning, and they're related to one another in terms of meaning, because they're answering questions for us. Who or what is or was doing what, when, where, how, and why. So here's the evidence on whether you're writing or reading. How do we build meaning? Well, we start with our words, right? Our parts of speech, they carry meaning. We go to our phrases, right? And our phrases carry meaning as well. And those are just 3 types of phrases that are represented there: noun, verb, preposition. And then we work our phrases into clauses, independent or dependent. And then we work that into our sentences: simple, compound, complex, or compound, complex, could add it there. And one by one, that all adds up to our text, right? And we're integrating our meaning with these cohesive ties. So when you think a little bit about this, and I'm going to go a little bit about this, you need to be thinking about how you would respond to this. How do you teach your kids the function of phrases, clauses, and different types of sentences? I'm going to work with parts of speech in a minute. One, you need to know what their jobs are. You need to be able to tell your students what they look like. You need to define them, but you also need to work with the phrases, the clauses, the different types of sentences from your text so that your students understand the jobs that they play. What kinds of questions do they answer? When you get to sentence types and their jobs, simple sentences convey an idea, right? Compound sentences, 2 related ideas. Complex, 1 idea dependent on the other. Those are different kinds of relationships, and we need to teach our students not just to be able to say, oh, a simple sentence is, but rather the kinds of relationships that they need to be looking for as they're working with them. Okay. So finally, she's showing me a framework. Okay. So here's an informed sentence framework. All right. So I'm not going to talk about incidental on purpose because we can develop the sense of syntax and sentence comprehension through reading experiences, oral language experiences, and through a writing connection. But I am going to talk very briefly about intentional on purpose or direct instruction here. And I'm going to start with an example of a grammar-based deconstruction activity, parts of speech. Right? I'm not going to do phrases and clauses, don't have the time, but I'm going to give you an example. I also want you to know there's lots of sentence-based activities you can use, and then hopefully I'm going to show you very briefly a cohesive device activity. So let's see. So here's a quick check. This is on your participant guide, right? Very often when we think about parts of speech, what comes to mind? A noun is the name of a person, place, or thing. No, no, no. I want you to tell me, what question does a noun answer? Or what questions? And I'll give you a hint. It's the second one down. A noun answers the question who or what. Don't you ask that kind of question in comprehension? Yeah, so your kid should be looking for nouns. Okay. See if you can just briefly think about each of these. You can take a minute to script or just think a little bit about how you would answer. Who, what, or whose? What part of speech is that? Is or was doing? What part of speech is that? Which one, how many, what kind? When, where, how, why? What's the relationship between the words before and after? And what's connected or needs to be glued together? So first, you need to know this, right? Before you can go to an activity in which you work with your students on the questions that different words answer. Okay, and here are the answers. So there are also some examples from dear Benjamin Banneker. Okay, so who, what, or whose, that's a pronoun. The. Already did who or what, Thomas Jefferson. Is or was doing in slaves, that's a verb. Which one, how many, what kind, unfair, that's an adjective. When, where, how, why? Courageously. Oh yeah, How did he act? Adverb. What's the relationship between the words before and after? Preposition. Okay. What's connected or needs to be glued together? But a conjunction. And I should have had an example for a preposition in there, but of, for instance, would be one. Okay. So I want to show you now an activity in which you can be my students that taps into what I just said, a deconstruction activity at the parts of speech level, right? So this activity is described in the book, if you have the book. If not, now you have it in your participant guide. And it says this: each word in a sentence has a job. Each is a building block of meaning. Remember, I talked about this already. We have learned that words answer different questions about the sentence, such as who or what it is all about. Let's review how these words can answer questions about meaning. All right, so I'm priming the pump here. All right, let's read this sentence from your text and find the words in the sentence that answer these questions. All right, so you see the sentence down below. All right, unfortunately, this system caused a lot of problems. Which word answers the question who or what? Everyone being my students, you're thinking about this? Well, I hope you're thinking
System.
or problem. Yeah,
I mean, I share it. It's a child from about 20 years ago.
I don't, it's hard to hear, but anyway, why don't we just stay mute and just think about it? Okay, that would be good. So which word answers the question who or what? System, or you might say problems, right? Which word tells us what the who or what was doing? Caused. Which word tells us about the who or what kind, how many, which one? Don't see it unless you said a lot of, but really a lot of problems is a phrase. It's a noun phrase. All right. Which words tell you when, where, or how? Unfortunately. How did it cause problems? Unfortunately. Okay. These words all come from sentences in your text. Your job is to match the word with the question it answers. I'll do one with you. So I just did a little bit of teaching. Now I'll do one with you. The word colonist. Now I'm taking a word if I were reading the founding of American democracy. The word colonist answers the question, well, I hope you're all thinking, who? Right? It's a noun. Let's try one together. Okay. The word interprets, again, this comes from the founding of American democracy, answers the question, and I hope you're all thinking, if we're doing it together, is or was doing. It's a doing word. So it's your turn now to match the rest of the word cards with the questions. So this is just kind of a basic idea of how one might introduce this type of activity, a deconstruction activity working with parts of speech. All right, here's the activity. All right, it's called a quick sort. Students need word cards, right? And the words come from the founding of American democracy. And they need those structured questions that tap into the function or the meaning of the parts of speech. Who or what is or was doing, which one, what kind, how many, when, where, how, for instance, right? So I already gave you the word colonists, for instance, and I gave you the word interprets. So you would have your students maybe work individually or in pairs, maybe you do a few more with them, right? And ultimately, here's what they would end up with. Okay. Now you would have taught them, think a little bit about this, that these different parts of speech, right, answer these questions. And you would have done explicit teaching, practice, all right, guided practice, and then provide for independent practice. Now, here's the other thing as you look at this. This gives us an opportunity to talk a little bit about some words that maybe have more than one function. Right? So if I'm looking at that first column, who or what, I see balance. And somebody might say, well, that belongs under is or was doing. And what would I say? Yeah, I put it there, right? And it's the context then that will allow for the student to understand, remember the word order, the syntax of the sentence will allow for the student to understand its function. Okay. All right, that's just one activity. There's several that you can tap into. How about cohesive devices? But I'm going to have enough time to briefly talk about this. All right. So one of the things I think we have to keep thinking about is that comprehension is an integrative process. Remember I said that we aggregate these successive units of meaning in order to build that mental model or overall understanding. So we have to keep integrating, word meaning, the sentences, within the sentences, between the sentences, integrating our background knowledge and so on. The words and ideas have to hang together in an organized way to make sense. One of the ways that authors connect up ideas within and between a sentence is through the use of cohesive devices, one of these being cohesive ties. Here are examples of cohesive ties. You've all seen these. You may or may not know this language, these descriptors. Pronoun reference. The author uses a pronoun to refer to a word found before or after in the text. Benjamin was telling Thomas Jefferson that he was a great man. And then it goes on. This is from Dear Benjamin Banneker. If you asked your students, who's he in that sentence, would they all know that it was Benjamin? Would they know that the he that occurs in the next sentence and in the next sentence is he? When you write, you don't use the same words over and over again. You probably use pronoun reference, or you might use substitutions or synonyms. Benjamin was telling Thomas Jefferson, and it goes on to talk about the Secretary of State. Who's the Secretary of State? Oh, it's Thomas Jefferson. Or there's a repetition that occurs, right? And in this next sentence, you see, again, Benjamin was telling Thomas Jefferson, but then again, you see Jefferson repeated. Oh, it's the same Thomas Jefferson. And then last but not least, sometimes the author omits one or more words. Jefferson owned slaves who he considered, right? And you have to infer, and this is a type of inference, believe it or not, you have to infer from something that's occurred earlier. So cohesive ties are anaphoric devices. Well, that's a nice word. Basically, it means that they take their meaning from another part of the sentence. Now, in terms of teaching cohesive ties, you don't teach them all at once, right? You explicitly directly teach students how authors use these devices in order to tie up and integrate meaning within and between sentences. And when we talk about sentence comprehension, this is a critical aspect of sentence comprehension that's often overlooked, because so many of our students, when you begin to talk with them about, well, who's the he or who's the she, or who's them or who's they've lost that, right, in translation. Or when there's a substitution or a synonym, they've lost that. You can also use coding with this, all right? And when I talk about a bit more about inference, because this is a type of inference, I talk about different coding systems, but you can come up with your own. Okay. So here's some examples. Okay. But in the same place, pronoun referent and underlined and bolded, Black Americans were, right? And if we begin to look for, where's the pronoun reference? Where are the pronouns that could stand in for Black Americans? Right? We see they, no one, and them. Right? And here's the coding, just happens to be boxed. Or if we look at synonyms and substitutions, I've underlined Benjamin, okay, well, and I could have bolded him as well. And we're going to look for some substitutions or synonyms for Benjamin. First Black man, only Black person. So again, making these connections, and you can do it through questioning and then through coding with your students, that authors use these different devices to tie up the meaning. All right. So coming back then, sorry, we don't have more time to talk about this, but at least we've had some opportunity to think a little bit about some grammar-based deconstruction activities, beginning with parts of speech. You can do the same thing with phrases, clauses, sentences. Some sentence-based activities. Sentence combining is quite powerful. So if you know how to do that, or you can look up sentence combining. Bruce Sadler, Saddler, is the person who's written quite a bit about that. The use of anagrams, where you take different words from a sentence, put them on separate cards, right? Have your students just work with those cards to create a sentence, and that conversation about which word goes where, what makes sense. That's also a very valuable activity. And then these cohesive device activities. Oftentimes this can just be a warm-up. Once you've explicitly taught your students how to work with this, and you've identified examples of these within the text, or sometimes you can morph them just a little bit for your own purposes. This gives the students an opportunity to be thinking about, or perhaps some of your questions as you're reading are going to be very focused on, well, what does that word mean? And what does it refer to, for instance, with cohesive device activities, right? Wow. Ideas, questions, connections, believe it or not. Okay, let's see what you have to say. Oops, didn't want to go there. Let's see what you have to say about this. Donna, it looks like there may be just a few things in the chat, huh?
Yeah, there's not much. I didn't really see anything.
Okay, I see, let's see. Oh, framing your thoughts, yeah, okay. Yeah, I know framing your thoughts, very nice. And you know, the more connection you can make between your reading comprehension and your writing, the better off you'll be, because so many of the same processes and skills, not all, but so many are involved. I use sentences for reading, yeah. Someone said, yeah, I do too.
Here's
unit
one.
sense, yeah.
How would you apply sentence level comprehension to help with understanding, solving math story problems?
Yeah, I would do the same kind of thing that I would do with a sentence from text. I try to pull out, you know, the who, the what, the, you know, what the question is, you know, solve, for instance, or calculate, or whatever the is or was doing words are, the verbs, and explaining the different meanings of those words. So it would be very similar for math problems that it would be for text.
Mm-hmm.
Except they're shorter, you know, sometimes. I love the questions around parts of speech. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Just, I want you to keep thinking about those cohesive devices. 3 read strategy for math problems is great. I don't know that, so maybe you can share that with your colleagues. Haven't worked a lot with the math story problems, but it's certainly an idea for the future. But again, sentences are sentences. So you just have to look at, are they constructed in what way? And is a math sentence constructed a bit differently than, let's say, a sentence that you find in text? All right. Well, we have 3 minutes left. So hopefully I've addressed some of your needs, not all. This was brief, but I greatly appreciate the fact that you joined. I've had a lovely evening as well. Thank you. And
Very
that I've
nice.
given some ideas. This is complex. And remember, 1 bite at a time. We're changing course just a few degrees at a time. The writing revolution advocate using their technique for maths. Okay, that's, yeah, good. Yeah, that's a very nice
Okay.
resource.
Thank you so much, Nancy. I just love, you know, I don't think we've had enough training and understanding what comprehension is. And so this is just so important to pull that upper strand of the rope apart and really dissect it
Yeah.
and unravel the rope and figure out what it's all about.
And then twist it back together because this is all integrated. And so,
Exactly.
I mean, I know we're taking it apart bit by bit, and it is important to do that so that we have these strategies and activities, but sometimes we can address more than one thing in a lesson. Yeah,
That's for sure.
yeah.
So,
Yeah.
okay, folks, oh, are people leaving? Oh, no. So two things I wanted to ask of you or just show you. These are stickers that I made for our Science of Reading Facebook page. And I was asking for a $20 donation. I'd like $10 donation. So they're on sale. Who doesn't like a sale? And you can send that to, and I put it in the chat. I'll put it in here. It's www.wyominglit.org/scholarship. Wyoming Lit and I and Washington Reads were partnering together to raise some money, and every penny goes toward teacher scholarships. Just to let you know, we gave away 128 scholarships to Top 10 Tools this past week, and we will be continuing offering scholarships to teachers as time goes on, but we need to make the money. So if you want one of these lovely stickers, you can do that. What else was I going to say? Okay, so Brooks Publishing generously offered to have a book giveaway. So I have picked someone who is here tonight, and the winner of the book of her choice from Brooks is Eliza Lang.
Yay. Good for
Yay.
you.
So I will send Eliza's email to Brooks, and she can pick something that she wants.
Oh my gosh, I'm so excited. Wait, so how will this work? I'm so excited.
You crack me up. So I'll send them your address and they'll write back to you.
Oh, so they're gonna email me.
Yes.
Oh my gosh, I'm so excited. Okay.
Well, good for you, Lisa.
Wait, what will my choices be?
I don't know.
Oh,
We'll
from
find
there.
out.
Oh my gosh. Okay. I'm so excited. Okay, sorry.
You have this book?
I do. I bought it.
Bought it. Okay. So, but they've got some really good books. So
Okay. I'm so excited. Thanks.
that is awesome. All right, my friends, have a great night. Thank you for coming. Thank you
Thanks,
so much
everybody.
Nancy, for your.
Hey, Donna,
Who's calling me?
Maureen. It's Maureen. Just the stickers, can we get those on the Science of Reading info website?
Yes.
Okay.
So it's in announcements,
Okay.
picture of the stickers, and then you go down and, oh no, you can't buy them there. I apologize. I wish
Okay.
you know what? Maybe I could do that. Isn't that a great idea?
I go to that website for everything. Yeah.
Oh, wait till you see the new look. We're
Okay.
modifying it. It's gonna look great.
Awesome.
Yeah. So, okay, you know what? It's not there now, but you know what? It
Okay.
might be. So
Okay.
just do the Y lit thing for now and
Okay.
perfect. Thank you.
Thanks, ladies.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. All right, take care, everybody. Thanks for hanging in there.
Nice job.
Yeah, thanks, Donna.
You're welcome.
Okay, all right.
I'm gonna stop recording.